Hi, I'm John Green. Welcome to my salon. This is Mental Floss Video, and did you know that the buttons are on a different side for men's and women's shirts? This is because historically Western men dressed themselves, but upper-class Western women had servants who dressed them. So men's shirts were designed to be easier to button by a right-handed wearer, but women's shirts are the opposite. They're easiest to button by a right-handed person who's not wearing the shirt. Anyway, that's the first of many fascinating historical fashion facts I'm going to share with you in this video today. We know around when people started wearing clothes, somewhere between 80 and 170,000 years ago. Unfortunately, the reason we know is pretty gross, because that's about the time the louse diverged into two different types: head lice and body lice. But comparatively, shoes are a new phenomenon. The oldest ones that have been found so far were from around 8500 BCE. They were made out of tree bark and discovered in the state of Oregon. Home of Nike, Oregon, innovating in shoe wear for 10,000 years. We can thank ancient Greek actors for platform sandals. They date back to around 220 BCE, and their height was a way for a play's audience to tell who was important. The actors wearing the tallest platforms were the stars, just like today with Tom Cruise. In ancient Egypt, noble women may have worn scented cones on their heads. Some believe that they were made of meltable materials like wax, and then the women would wear them in the heat so they would smell better as the cones melted. But for the record, experts aren't sure if they actually existed or if they were just depicted in art. Kimonos, on the other hand, definitely existed. Japanese people probably started wearing them around the 8th century, and the word literally translates to the thing worn. Speaking of fashion terms, we got the word candidate from a Latin word meaning white toga. In ancient Rome, politicians would wear those white togas, so it made sense that the word evolved into a political meaning. Another ancient figure with distinct clothing, the ninja. Although interestingly, they didn't historically wear black. The 16th century Japanese ninjas wore dark navy blue at night because it was actually better camouflage. Ancient Chinese men wore Dao Pao robes for formal wear, and during the Ming Dynasty, around the 14th through 17th century CE, these robes would feature badges of animals or birds, indicators of civil and military ranks. As for the concept of fashion, it emerged in Europe around the mid-14th century. Basically, styles began to change much quicker than they had previously. Europeans were expected to keep up with trends more frequently than earlier in history, as well as compared with other populations. A couple centuries later, Rose Bertin came along and helped define what fashion would mean to Western society. She was a French woman who made dresses for Marie Antoinette. Antoinette is still viewed as a kind of fashion icon, and it was Bertin who styled her. The two collaborated and set trends for all of France. Also, unlike Marie Antoinette, Bertin died with her head attached to her body. Let that be a lesson to you: always be the fashion designer, never be the model. Another fashion icon, Napoleon Bonaparte. He wore an over 80-pound cape to his coronation. 4 men were needed to help carry it. But it wasn't all about trends. Sometimes fashion became law, like in England in 1571, men over the age of 6 were officially required to wear a hat on Sundays. It's obviously not a law anymore, but many English people still wear hats to certain events like weddings. Around the time England was legislating hat use, a type of platform shoe became popular known as the chopine. They were especially popular in Venice, Italy, but the trend really got out of hand as the shoe's height was supposed to represent social standing. Eventually, some wealthy people were bringing servants with them everywhere just to hold them up on both sides, because the shoes reached up to 20 inches before high heels took over. Hey, how tall are you? Oh, I'm 5'3", but in chopines, I'm 8'4". And we actually have men in the West to thank for high heels. They wore high heels during the 17th and 18th centuries, inspired by Persian cavalry who wore heels to better stay in stirrups. And at the time, women often stole fashion trends from men, including heels. Eventually, men dropped them, but women never have. In the 1850s and 60s in England, about 3,000 women died in a very specific type of accident. Their hoop skirts caught on fire. These were called crinoline fires, named after the skirts. Basically, the skirts often had flammable coverings, and they were very large, so it was risky to be around fire, and of course there were lots of fires to be around. Around the same time, women's clothing came with another risk. Wider and wider skirts became trendy until it was difficult for women to go through doorways without getting stuck. stuck. Eventually, toward the turn of the 20th century, skirts became larger towards the back rather than the sides. We associate cowboy boots with American cowboys, but their shoe ancestors probably came from Spain and became widespread in the New World thanks to vaqueros, Spanish cowboys and herders. Then Americans combined that style with Wellington boots to give us the modern cowboy boot. Bell-bottoms also have an interesting history. They were originally worn by sailors. Eventually, the US Navy and the British Royal Navy adopted the style, and by the end of the 19th century, virtually every country's navy had bell-bottoms as part of their official uniform. And speaking of military uniforms, during the Revolutionary War, musicians had a special outfit to set them apart from people in combat. In the 19th century, stilts were the thing to wear in the region of Lens, France. They helped local shepherds deal with the swampy area, but people of all ages and professions owned stilts and knew how to walk with them. Stilts aside, the 1800s were a really important time for fashion in France. This was when department stores started popping up in Paris, and thanks to new textile technology, the middle class was able to wear clothes that they never could before. We associate the word flapper with women in the 1920s, but the word itself may have come from a type of overshoe. They were basically rain boots that women in Great Britain wore that flapped as they walked because they didn't take the time to fasten them. And speaking of flappers, there's a theory known as the hemline theory. It posits that when short skirts are trendy, it's correlated with better economic times. So in the 1920s, for instance, hemlines were shorter, but longer skirts were popular during the Great Depression. And the 1960s were another time of great economic growth in the United States, also when miniskirts were invented. But whether or not that's true, fashion is often connected to what's going on in the world. Like during the Reign of Terror, the formerly aristocratic youth started dressing bizarrely as a sort of rebellion. This included a lot of hairpieces with accents like feathers. But back to the miniskirt. Did you know the miniskirt was named after the Mini Cooper? A woman named Mary Quant sometimes gets credit for inventing the miniskirt. Its inventor is a controversial subject, but we do know that Quant named it. She once explained that both the car and the skirt were optimistic, exuberant, and young. In Britain, there were official blackouts even before the World War II bombing actually started, and because of this, many people started to wear light-up and glowing accessories like buttons and handbags. And speaking of World War II, it kind of inspired New York Fashion Week. Like before the war, Parisian designers influenced American ones, but France was occupied by the Germans, so people in the fashion world could no longer go there for inspiration. That's why publicist Eleanor Lambert created the event in New York City, then known as Press Week. Moving on to something more uplifting, boat shoes were inspired by dogs. They were invented in the 1930s by a sailor named Paul Sperry. He saw how the grooves in his dog's paws helped him to walk in wet conditions, so he designed shoes with similar ones. The Lacoste crocodile is considered the first ever designer logo. The company was created by a tennis player named René Lacoste, who also invented the first modern tennis shirt in 1933. And speaking of clothing inventors, when Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis created the first jeans, they called them waist-high overalls. Check out our brand new strapless overalls, all the hotness of your overalls, but now with no straps. Hawaiian shirts have been around since about the 1920s. Japanese immigrants to Hawaii brought the bright fabrics with them that we also associate with kimonos, and then from the 1920s through the 1940s, various people living in Hawaii contributed to the style until they were popular enough to be mass-produced. It's believed that the no white after Labor Day fashion rule originated in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This was back when the upper class would go on extended vacations during the summer, and then they would return to school and work, meaning packing away those lightweight white clothes. Another theory is that women from old money created fashion rules like this one in order to distinguish themselves from new money women. Basically, it makes no sense and you should wear white whenever you want to. And finally, I returned to my salon to tell you why we wear black to funerals. So for centuries, people had customs for mourning depending on their culture. In some European countries, white was actually worn, but after Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria wore black for another 40 years. And from then on, black was the standard in Western cultures. Thanks for watching Mental Floss video, which is made with the help of all of these nice people, including our hardworking costumer. That's me, actually. I dress myself. In comments, let me know what fashion trends you think we should bring back. I miss the really baggy jeans, the ones I wore in high school. Anyway, as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.